And to discuss this, let's go to our guests in the U.S. Capitol. Walter Smith is the executive director of the D.C. Appleseed Center for Law and Justice. Hans von Spakovsky manages the Heritage Foundation's Election Law Reform Initiative. Gentlemen, welcome to the Newsmakers. Walter, we have to start with you because you've launched a lawsuit to get full representation in Congress for D.C. Why have you done that? How have you done that? What's the basis for your legal argument?
Well, we've done that because people who live in the nation's capital have been without voting representation, believe it or not, since the founding of the capital in 1801. The rest of the country went to the polls last week to elect their voting representatives, but people who live in the capital didn't do that. So they instead went to court to try to get equal rights. The argument is that it violates the U.S. Constitution in that it denies a fundamental right to U.S. citizens who pay their taxes, obey the laws, go to war, but have no voting representation in the U.S. Congress. And the lawsuit says that this violates equal protection, violates the Due Process Clause, and violates the First Amendment to the Constitution.
In 1978, you'll know this very well, there was a proposed amendment to the U.S. Constitution to do exactly this, to give voting rights to Congress people elected for D.C. And it didn't pass. It wasn't ratified by enough states. Only 16 out of the 38 ratifications were received. But this is slightly different, what you're doing. Is this the first time a lawsuit has been filed with this intent?
Well, it's the first time a lawsuit has been filed which says that the Congress of the United States can simply pass a law giving the people in the district the vote. You are right that in 1978 an effort was made to amend the Constitution, but since then the Congress, both in 2007 and 2009, passed bills indicating that, in fact, Congress has the authority to simply pass, through simple legislation, a law that would give district residents a vote. So this is different from the constitutional amendment that was tried. It's different from the earlier lawsuit. It's a much simpler way to get at it, and we think it's a very strong argument.
Hans, what about the legal issues here? Unconstitutional, probably even against international law, which allows every citizen of the world to have representation in their domestic legislature, and people in D.C. don't.
Yeah, but you have to understand.
Well, that is true.
If you look at our original Constitution, you'll see that the nation's capital was set up as the government seat and as an insular district. It was supposed to be autonomous. It was not supposed to be subject to pressure from any state government. So this is in the Constitution itself. And this issue legally has already been decided. In 2000, a lawsuit was filed claiming that the lack of representation in Congress was a violation of the Constitution, equal protection, and those other provisions. The federal district court said, no, it is not a violation. It is not a problem under the Constitution. And that decision was affirmed, called Adams v. Clinton, by the United States Supreme Court. So the issue has already been decided. The only way the district could be made a state and therefore have representation is through a constitutional amendment. That's already been tried, as you mentioned, and the states did not approve it.
Walter?
Well, that's actually not true. The earlier lawsuit addressed the issue only of whether or not district residents could be treated as residents of a state within the meaning of Article 1, Section 2. We now understand under that court ruling we cannot be treated as residents of state under Article 1, Section 2. However, as I said before, after that decision came down, the Congress of the United States decided that even though we're not residents of a state, it has the authority under what's called the District Clause to give us the vote nevertheless. And what makes this argument that they need to do that so strong is that Congress has already treated other people who don't live in states as being entitled to voting representation. that includes people who once lived in states and moved overseas, or people who live in what are called federal enclaves, which are military bases, national parks, and the like. So the central argument in this new lawsuit is that it violates equal protection for Congress to allow voting representation to other people who don't live in states, which the Congress has done, but to deny that voting representation to people who live in the district. So it's very different from the first lawsuit. It doesn't require a constitutional amendment because Congress has already said it has the authority through simple legislation to confer the vote.
Okay, Hans, the legal argument aside, really, honestly, if you look at it from the outside, if you're not an American, people will be wondering, hold on, this isn't anything super controversial. We're not talking about gun laws here. We're not talking about illegal narcotics. We're talking about people being given the right to vote and to have a representative inside the legislature who will speak for them. Why? Why would anybody be against that?
You look at the original debates in our Constitutional Convention, as I've said, the framers of the Constitution said they wanted the nation's capital not to be subject to the pressures of a state government. The only way under the Constitution that the District of Columbia can be given voting rights is if it is made a state. That requires a constitutional amendment. Congress cannot do it. And anyone who doubts that, all you have to do, you can Google the case I was talking about, Adams v. Clinton, and you will see that all of these issues were dealt with in that decision, which was affirmed by the Supreme Court. So you can't do this through a lawsuit. And I actually think that the original arguments about this are still correct today. You don't want the Washington, D.C. and the Congress to be subject to potential pressure from the local government. If people want to be able to vote, they have an easy way to do that. They can move into one of the surrounding states, and there they have voting rights. It certainly doesn't in any way hurt the district when it comes to federal money. When it comes to the dollars per resident, Washington, D.C. gets more money than a majority of the states around the country. That's
look, presumably
that's just part of our Constitution, the way the government was designed, and there isn't any reason to change it.
Yeah, but presumably that also means that people who live in D.C. earn a lot more money than the average American national. But you're saying 700,000 people should leave D.C. if they want those kind of rights to be represented inside Congress.
No, what I'm saying is they made a decision to move into the district, and under our Constitution, which has existed for more than 200 years, this was the design that was put into it, and there isn't any reason to change it today.
Walter?
Well, can I just respond to this? The framers of our Constitution certainly never intended that this great democracy they were creating would exclude from that democracy the people who lived in the nation's capital. When the Constitution was written, the intent of the framers was that everyone who lived in the country would be represented in the Congress. The problem arose in that when the Constitution was written, the nation's capital had not yet been created. It was created several years later out of portions of states. But the idea that we would be the only nation's capital in the world that would deny democracy to those who lived here is completely foreign to the original concept of the framers of our Constitution.
That is not true. That is not true. You can look at the history of the Constitutional Convention. You can look at the notes that James Madison took. Congress very specifically gave representation in Congress only to states. And they very specifically said that the District of Columbia, it's not a state, so it doesn't fall within the congressional representation as outlined in the rest of the Constitution. And the notes from the debates show that that is just not the case.
How much does this fall?
Wait a minute. No.
Go on, Walter.
You're confusing two different things here. The fact that they were trying to give representation only to people who lived in states does not mean that they intended that when the nation's capital was later created out of two portions of states, that the framers intended the people who lived in the nation's capital wouldn't have voting representation. And I need to respond to something else the gentleman said a minute ago. It is not true that statehood for the district could be created only through a constitutional amendment. Statehood could be created as one way to give voting representation to people who live in the district through simple legislation. Under our Constitution, new states were created.
It cannot. The District of Columbia is specifically set out in the Constitution. You have to change the Constitution to do that. That's why in 1961, it took a constitutional amendment to give the residents of the district the ability to vote for president. But the provisions in the Constitution which define who has representation in Congress specifically refer to states, not the District of Columbia.
Okay, do you mind if we just look at the politics?
No one is disagreeing with that.
Okay, can we just look at the politics of this? Hans, how much does this break down along partisan lines between Republicans and Democrats, right? Because I think most people know who follow U.S. politics that D.C. is a very Democratic district. If it were to become a state, it would probably elect Democrats to the House and the Senate. How important is that? And how much does that mean Republicans are against this change?
No, I think what Republicans are saying is that if you're going to do this, you have to do it through a constitutional convention. And the fact that the 1977 constitutional amendment that was passed by Congress and then sent to the states was only approved by such a small number of states shows you that even Democratic states did not want to approve it, because there were more than 16 Democratic states at that time, and yet they weren't approving of this change either.
Walter, do you think Republicans are scared what might happen if your desired change came about?
Well, can I just say something on this issue? In our view, this should not be a partisan issue. The right of all Americans to have full voting representation in the Congress should not depend on whether or not they're Democrats or Republicans. And I think it's worth noting, as I tried to mention a minute ago, that in 2007 and again in 2009, simple legislation passed both houses of Congress that would have given voting representation at that time only in the House of Representatives to people who live in the district. So we've already established that Congress has the authority to do this. It's because they've refused to do it since then that we've brought a lawsuit saying that it denies equal protection for them to fail to do it.
Hans, is it fair to say that actually this change we're talking about, that's the subject of the lawsuit, would actually be good for the people of D.C., which has, in the entire United States, some of the highest rates of HIV, of crime, of joblessness, that it would actually help the people who live there?
No, I don't think you can make that assumption, because the District of Columbia government has been notoriously badly run. Ever since home rule was granted to D.C., they have limited home rule. They're able to elect their own members of their city council and mayor. The city has been known for many years as one of the worst run cities in the country. So the idea that somehow giving it representation in Congress is somehow going to improve the efficiency of the local government, I mean, you've got no evidence to show that whatsoever.
Walter?
Well, I have to respond to that. I mean, the District of Columbia government is currently one of the best managed cities in the country and has been running surpluses for many years, has accomplished a great deal in the last decade or so. But again, in our view, the issue is not whether they're Democrats or Republicans. The issue is not whether or not the city is well-run or not well-run. We don't judge people's ability to have voting representation in their legislatures based on how well their local government may be run or whether or not they're Democrat or Republican. If we started doing that, there would be a whole lot of folks in the United States that wouldn't have voting representation. Our view is that This country was founded on the proposition of no taxation without representation, and on the view that we would have a government that was run based on the consent of the governed. The District of Columbia is the only capital of any democracy in the world that denies voting representation in its national legislature to the citizens of its nation's capital. And the good news is, now that we know Congress has the authority to address this long-standing inequity, the courts have the authority to hold the refusal to give us the vote unconstitutional, and I hope and think that is what the courts will do.
Walter, we shall see what happens with your lawsuit. Walter and Hans, thank you for joining us on the Newsmakers. Very interesting.